Morning. I want to take a minute and I want to thank everybody for all the cards and letters and words of encouragement on my hip surgery, and it went very well, and I appreciate everything. Some of the delicious food that arrived at our house. It's so nice to have such a wonderful church family to really rely on. My granddaughter works over at Story Point, and she had a class of art that she teaches over there, and I got a handful of get well cards, and it was really touching. Most of all, I want to thank my wife. Okay, what we're here for. Our reading today is Mark 4:10 through 20. When he was alone, the 12 and the other around him asked him about the parables. He told them, "The secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those who are on the outside, everything is said in parables, so that they may be ever seeing but never perceiving, and ever hearing but never understanding. Otherwise they might turn and be forgiven." Then Jesus said to them, "Do you understand these parables? How then will you understand any parable? The farmer sows the word. Some people are like seeds along the path. When the word is sown, as soon as they hear it, Satan comes and takes away the word that was sown in them. Others, like seeds sown on rocky places, hear the word and at once received it with joy. But since they have not root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. Still others, like seeds sown among thorns, hear the word. But the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth and desire for other things come in and choke the word, accept it, and produce a crop. Some 30, some 60, some 100 times what was sown."
Good morning. Ted, I appreciate you sharing those words on a personal note about all that everyone has done for you, and I want everyone to, sorry, excuse me, my voice is having a little trouble this morning. I want you all to know that your actions in times like that will preach louder than any sermon we give up here. I also want to apologize to Jim if Mark is not his favorite gospel, and we're going to be spending the next 5 weeks in it, so sorry. No, I'm just giving you a hard time. I know what you're saying, not playing favorites, but it is interesting how how God gives us the story of the life of Jesus from these different perspectives, and each of them do have their own, not their own slant, but they're each trying to highlight different aspects and different things about the amazing things that Jesus did. I'm sorry, give me just a second. So we're going to be starting this morning in Mark chapter 3, verse 13, and calling this lesson The Tale of Two Kingdoms. God's kingdom, of course, and the kingdom of Satan. We're going to touch on that in just a minute, but to kind of summarize where we are, this is all in the grander scope of what we've been introducing this year as our focus on shine, about letting our light shine so that people may see our good deeds and glorify our Father in heaven. And so for the first chunk of the year, we're going to be looking at the life of Jesus in the Gospels and how that Jesus was the embodiment of this. And then we'll go on looking back to some things in the Old Testament and then to some things in the New Testament letters. But as part of this focusing on the life of Jesus, we wanted to start with the Gospel of Mark. And the series as a whole, ranging all the way from last week, January 22nd, up to the end of February, we're calling The Suffering Servant. And in this, we are focusing on the way Mark tells the story, because Mark does seem to place a particular emphasis on Jesus being a servant and how he was always doing and acting and moving and immediately this and immediately that, and he went here and he did that. But then Mark also places a big emphasis on suffering and on how the disciples just didn't get it. They just didn't understand. And that's something we're going to dive into a little more next week. He kind of structures three different instances back to back to back where Jesus is trying to tell them, and it's just not clicking in their head. But that's not really our focus today. Last week we talked about reflecting God's glory, and starting with John. There at the very beginning of the Gospel of Mark, John points to Jesus. And then Jesus comes on the scene, and after the baptism and calling the first disciples, he gets busy. I mean, if you look over that text from last week, he gets busy serving. He casts out an unclean spirit. He calls more fishermen. He healed Peter's mother-in-law. Then in chapter 1, verse 34, it says that he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. He got up and prayed before dawn. In chapter 1, verse 39, it says he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. He healed a man of leprosy. He healed a man who was paralyzed. And then where this man in chapter 2 is, I'll take some of that. This man in chapter 2 who's paralyzed, the four friends bring him to the house. Thank you, sir. The four friends bring him to the house where Jesus is, and they can't get in the house, and so they break open the roof and lower him down through, all that big crowd of scribes and Pharisees, they didn't like that. They said, who can forgive sins but God alone? So he goes on to teach them, and teach them patiently, might I add. He's very patient and restrained in his teaching of them in Mark chapter 2 there. And then right after that, he calls Matthew, and then again, he patiently answers questions from the Pharisees. At this point, the Pharisees seem to be just kind of asking questions. They seem to be curious, and they're trying to figure it all out. They're not dead set against him just yet. It doesn't seem, they may be, but the way Mark presents it, it seems like they're just kind of asking questions. And so Jesus is patient with them again. And then he heals a man with a withered hand. This is as we get into the beginning of chapter 3. It's in a synagogue, and it's on the Sabbath day. They get real upset about this one. And Jesus finally, it says, he looked around, he told the man to come here. He says, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. And in verse 5 it says, he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. And then he goes on to heal him. But it's just interesting. Jesus is so patient with them as they're asking questions, but now as they're in the synagogue on the Sabbath, and you would think they would be excited about doing good. But no, they're not willing to get out of their comfort zone. And I think if I'm honest with myself, that's probably the crowd I would find myself in. I'm a don't rock the boat, don't create a lot of waves kind of person. I'm afraid I would probably be the one kind of sitting there saying, well, I'm not saying don't help the guy, but you could just maybe not make such a big deal about it. Maybe not on the Sabbath, maybe not here in the synagogue. I don't know. Maybe that's where I would be. I would try to be kind of riding the fence. That's my personality. But after this, we have this transition statement in Mark chapter 3, verses 7 through 12, and that ends with him casting out many unclean spirits, and they fell down before him and cried out, you are the Son of God. And he strictly ordered them not to make him known. So that brings us up to the start of our lesson today in Mark chapter 3, verse 13. From there through verse 19, we have the account of him calling the apostles. Now these are the 12 apostles. Sometimes they're just referred to as the 12, sometimes they're referred to as the apostles, but there's a distinction here among these 12. If you know the song, Jesus called them one by one, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. I won't sing the whole thing, but these 12 are distinct in the sense that they have this special commission from God. They are set apart as apostles. One who is sent is really what that word means. And so they have the special job to be with Jesus, to be the ones closest to him, as it says there in verse 14, so that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach. So over the next couple of years, they're going to be the ones closest to him. They're going to be the ones spending the most time with him, the ones soaking up as much of the teaching of Jesus as they possibly can. And then, a little bit while Jesus is still on the earth, he's going to send them out, on the limited commission and here and there. But then after Jesus ascends back into heaven, he turns it over to them. And they go everywhere. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth, preaching the gospel. So these 12 have this very specific function in the infant kingdom here. As Jesus is presenting his concept of the kingdom and this idea. And another thing to note here in this whole section is all this is happening in the area of Galilee. Some would call this the first Galilean ministry, and I thought if I'd have been a little more on top of things, I'd have had us a map up here, and we talked about Jerusalem and how they would come down, even though Galilee is north of Jerusalem. You go downhill, so they would say they came down from Jerusalem, and so. But this area is a little bit off, on the southwest side of the Sea of Galilee, but right there with Capernaum and all that. So he calls the 12, and then there's a really interesting thing that happens here as we get into Mark chapter 3, verse 20. He kind of begins this thread about his family, and then it kind of gets interrupted, and then it kind of comes back to it. And Mark does this a lot. Some call it the Markan sandwich, M-A-R-K-A-N sandwich. Some call it interpolation. You kind of interpolate. You kind of put one story in the middle of another story. And so you've got kind of bookends and one story in the middle, or a sandwich where you got the bread and the meat in the middle, however you want to look at it. There's some big fancy word that I can't even really pronounce that a bunch of biblical scholars use for it. But anyway, this shows up in Mark, and it's really interesting because look what he says here in verse 20. He says, "Then he went home." This is chapter 3, verse 20. "And the crowd gathered again so that they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, 'He's out of his mind.'" So he kind of introduces his family here and saying that they don't really know what to think about this yet. But then he says the scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, and so he goes off onto this story here all the way through verse 30. And then he picks up again in verse 31 with the other slice of bread in the sandwich. And he says, "And his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, 'Your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you.' And he answered them, 'Who are my mother and my brothers?' And looking about at those who sat around him, he said, 'Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother.'" So you've kind of got these two slices of bread talking about his family and kind of the nature of the kingdom. But then the meat of this story is talking about the kingdom of Satan and the accusations that are made against Jesus here. So backing up to verse 22, let's kind of examine that for a minute. It says, "The scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, 'He's possessed by Beelzebub, and by the prince of demons he cast out the demons.' And he called to them and said to them in parables, 'How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand.'" Now this statement here, it's kind of just a truism that could be applied to really anything. A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. But Jesus is not using this on the positive side of the coin in the way Abraham Lincoln, plucked it out and said, a house divided can't stand. Because what he's talking about is the kingdom of Satan. He's not talking about holding the house together. He doesn't want to hold that house together. He's talking about the kingdom of Satan, but he's pointing out the fact that Satan would never do anything to actually hurt himself. He would never actually hinder his cause. And it's interesting to see in Here's a little teaser for our care groups coming up starting in March, that we're going to be kind of talking about kind of the tactics of Satan and some of the ways that he tries to get at us. But it's interesting to see here that he says that the house divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is coming to an end. So he kind of puts this out there like Satan wouldn't actually be fighting against himself, even though sometimes it seems like it, doesn't it? So I wrestled with this verse for a long time. I almost felt like if you see some sort of conflict in the world, you've got to assume that one of them is good and one of them is bad, because Satan wouldn't fight against Satan, would he? So somebody's got to be good in every conflict, but that's not really the case, because sometimes Satan has kind of different arms of his kingdom out there, and one arm may look like it's fighting with the other arm, but in reality, it all comes back to Satan. You know what I mean? Let me illustrate it this way. Some people really like a certain brand of cars, and some people feel a certain sense of brand loyalty to their cars. Dennis, you've got a Chevy and a Ford, so which do you prefer? No? Okay. So some people have this brand loyalty to a certain car, but then if you look on the big scale and you start digging behind all these different brand labels that they just slap on it, a lot of these are owned by the same big overarching umbrella. I was asking Derek about this with his business acumen, asking him to give me some examples of some of these businesses that kind of have this big umbrella, and they make it seem like these two arms down here are competing against each other, but in reality, your money's all going to the same place. It's all going to the same bigwigs, making them rich. When you think of Volkswagens, what do you think of? Do you think of the old Beetles from back in the day, slug bugs, however you want to say it? Well, that's where they first gained their popularity. But do you realize that Volkswagen is the biggest car manufacturer in the world today? And that under their umbrella, they have Audi, Bentley, Porsche, and Lamborghini? Porsche and Lamborghini, you picture like you got a Corvette club. I don't know, I guess are there Porsche and Lamborghini clubs? I don't know. Nobody's ever invited me to be part of one. But let's say you got a Porsche and a Lamborghini club. Do they kind of have this rivalry against each other? Well, it doesn't matter. They're all sending their money to Volkswagen anyway. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter which branch or which arm someone feels loyalty to. It's all going to the same place. And so that's kind of this one picture that Jesus draws of Satan, or kind of that helped me to understand. That concept helped me to understand how Satan's kingdom is multifaceted. But when Jesus comes in and he casts this demon out of the sky, but it happened more than once, or he starts casting demons out of people, he's not just transferring one to the other. That's like the equivalent of, it's not like the equivalent of buying a Bentley instead of a Porsche. It's the equivalent of the EPA coming in and shutting down the entire Bentley line of things, or something like that. I don't know if the EPA could do that. I don't know. But it's the equivalent of coming in and shutting down the whole operation. It's not just transferring one to the other. And so what Jesus is saying here, he's saying, look, when I cast that demon out of that guy, that did real damage to Satan's kingdom. And Satan would never actually do anything that brought real damage to his kingdom. He's going to work it from different angles and make it seem like it sometimes, but no, he's never going to do anything to hurt himself. And so he's kind of getting their minds going and their wheels turning to think, oh, well, maybe that you're right, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that Satan would actually be doing something to hurt himself. And then he goes on to say, verse 27, but no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man. Then indeed he may plunder his house. And so the illustration here, the strong man is Satan here, and the house would be the person who's possessed, and the goods here being plundered would be the demons. And so Jesus is saying, look, I'm bigger and stronger. You think he's a strong man? I just went and bound him up and plundered the goods of his house and got rid of him and did something that was actually damaging to the kingdom of Satan. And so all this kind of goes into their minds and their thinking. And then in verse 28 it says, truly I say to you, all sins will be forgiven the children of man, but whatever blasphemies they utter, and whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. For they were saying, he has an unclean spirit. Now, in our short time together here in this sermon this morning, I'm not going to dive into blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. And I think that's part of the role of preaching. When we stand up here and give a sermon, I hope this is not the totality of your biblical intake for this week. I hope that what we present up here kind of whets your appetite, and you think, ooh, what about that blasphemy of the Holy Spirit thing? And maybe you want to go research it more this week. Maybe you want to come back for Bible class. Maybe you want to show up on Tuesday and ask Ted and Richard and Bob about it. They're always taking questions, and and so I don't think it's the place of public preaching to dive into these deep, deep matters. I hope you're getting that from other places. Don't let this be the only nourishment you're getting this week. So then we finish up with what I read earlier about Jesus' mother and brothers, and we've got this other side of the sandwich here. And so he's making a big statement about the nature of his kingdom versus the nature of Satan's kingdom, but then also over and against the worldly concept of family ties and earthly ties and all the things that feel really important to us while we're here. And I'm not saying that they're not important, but he's pointing out here that true membership in the kingdom of God is not so much about those earthly relationships as it is about doing the will of God. Verse 35, last verse in chapter 3, for whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. There's a sense in which to be part of this kingdom, to be part of God's kingdom, it's not just a sitting back and agreeing with. It's not just a sitting back and trying to figure out what God's will is. Sometimes we think of the will of God like that. We think, well, am I supposed to buy this house or that house? Am I supposed to go to this college or that college? Am I supposed to marry this person or that person? And I think sometimes we can get so hung up on those details, and I'm not saying not to seek God's will in those decisions. Absolutely seek God's will in those decisions. But what I'm saying, there's a sense in which God's will is bigger than that. And another way we could phrase this about doing the will of God is that we must participate in the will of God. When you think about it that way, you use the word participate in the will of God rather than do the will of God. It becomes more than just figuring out which decision God thinks I should make here and going with that route. There becomes a part of this getting on board and participating and being a force for good and being part of this kingdom as it's marching forward and marching on down through the ages. So he makes that very clear here. And then as we get into chapter 4, he does something kind of unusual for Mark. Mark, like I said, is very action-packed and very, one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. He doesn't include a lot of parables, except for right here in chapter 4. Right here in chapter 4, he kind of takes a little time aside and he kind of lumps some of these parables together. Now, whether Jesus sat down and told these parables like this all on the same day, we don't know. Because remember, Mark probably got a lot of this information from Peter, and the Holy Spirit is inspiring him, and he's writing the literary structure of it in such a way to point toward the themes that he's presenting about Jesus. And so here at this point, as he's made so many things clear about the kingdom, with the place of the apostles in the kingdom, with how different and how radically different the nature of God's kingdom is, and now he's going to tell some parables kind of showing what life is like in that kingdom. And so first he tells us the parable of the sower, and I won't spend too much time diving into the details of this other than to say, sorry, I've written on 4 sides of the same sheet of paper, and okay, there it is. So I won't go too far into the details of this other than just to highlight a few points from each. With the parable of the sower, I think the biggest lesson for us today is to not be soil judgers. You know, we don't decide whether or not we think that person will be receptive to the gospel before we share the gospel with them. That's not our job. Our job is to sow the seed. Some of it falls on the wayside. Okay, some of it falls on rocky or thorny ground. That's not up to us. Our job is to sow the seed. We're not supposed to be spending so much time thinking about whether or not they will. And I think it's interesting here. It says that the seed on the thorny soil, it doesn't die. It's merely unfruitful. That when it talks about the cares and pleasures of this life coming up and choking that growing seed, it doesn't say with the rocky soil. It says, yeah, it dies, it falls away. And so you would kind of picture that as someone who kind of falls away from the church, someone who goes back into the world. But then with the seed on the thorny soil, it never says that it dies. It just says that it's unfruitful. So maybe this person hasn't really fallen away from church. Maybe this person is still sitting in the pew week in, week out, but not living a fruitful life, not bearing any fruit for God because of all the worldly cares and pleasures that are taking up the other 167 hours in the week. But then ultimately, from this parable of the soils is, don't be discouraged. He tells us that the success rate is not going to be good. And even if this was meant to be a literal 25%, across with the 4 soils, which I don't think it is. But even if it was, he's telling us our success rate isn't going to be great. So don't be discouraged. If we share the gospel with somebody and, they come and they're baptized and they're only here for a couple of weeks and they fall away, yes, that should bother us. It should make us sad. It shouldn't make us, but we've got to know that's the nature of people's hearts. If someone is baptized and they keep coming and they keep coming and they keep coming, but they never seem to bear any fruit, they never seem to have any spiritual growth, yeah, that should make us frustrated and sad, and we realize that's not God's will for someone's life, but we know that's the nature of people's hearts. And so all of this that we see, and all the times, which I think is the vast majority, like I said, I don't think that this is 25, 25, 25, 25. Probably more like 90% is the wayside soil. All the times we try to share the gospel and it doesn't seem to go anywhere. Don't be discouraged. It's not up to us as the ones sowing the seed. It's between their heart and God. We can't control their heart, their response, their decisions. All we can do is plant and water. So don't be discouraged when things go like this, when things go like the parable of the soil. Instead, I think maybe we ought to be suspicious when things don't go like that. If there's a church somewhere that never seems to have anybody ever fall away or never seems to ever have anybody turn them down. I once heard, I shouldn't say this, I once heard a preacher among Churches of Christ he had a evangelism method, let's say, kind of a series of studies, and he was advertising it as 100% success rate. I was like, you can't do that. There's no way. There's no way you can have, if you have 100% success rate with evangelism, you're not doing something right, because that's what he says here. He says that this is the nature of people's hearts. You'll never have 100% success rate. Okay, I'll get off that soapbox for a minute. So he talks about the parable of the sower, and then he goes on to explain parables, and he kind of uses this as a paradigm to follow in interpreting other parables. And then he goes to the lamp under a basket, hide it under a bushel. No. All right. I was going to see if Gloria remembered that from Thursday. Hide it under a bushel. No. Yeah. So it's kind of that same concept, but it's different from the way that he mentions it in Matthew and in the Sermon on the Mount there. I think it's interesting that you get a lot of these pieces and I think a lot of people try to go back and textual critics and all that, and they try to say, see all these source theories and whatnot. Well, if you know any preachers, we have some of the same stories that we will use in a different context. We might use the same story talking to this group today, and then if we're talking to another group on a different day, we may use the same story, but we may apply it to a different passage. Preachers do that. Jesus did that. And Mark records this for us where he's talking about the lamp and putting it under a basket as more of an illustration of the pay attention to what you hear. With what measure you use, it'll be measured to you. More so than as Matthew uses it about letting our light shine so that people may see our good deeds and glorify our Father in heaven. And then he talks about the seed growing. And he says, the kingdom of God is as if a man should scatter seed on the ground. He sleeps and rises, and it sprouts, and it grows, and he knows not how. It is so amazing. All the things that God has put together in this world, even today with all of our scientific advances, we can describe what happens. We can describe how the seed and the, little bit inside, and we can describe what situation, what circumstances, the moisture, the heat, and, all the different things. We can describe that, but we still don't really know how or why. There's so much about this that still boggles our minds to figure out, and at best of what we can do with science is to describe it. But he says, when we're scattering that seed, the earth produces by itself. First the blade, then the ear, then the full grain on the ear. And when the grain is ripe, at once he puts in the sickle because the harvest has come. This just reminds me of back to the parable of the sower, of I am so glad, so thankful it's not my job to be a soil judger. I have seen God work in so many lives where, I'll be honest, I was skeptical when a person maybe first starts coming or has a certain situation, and I'll be like, I don't know if I believe your story, but we'll still go ahead and, still kind of, I'll still treat, I'm not saying I would say things like that to their face, but there are times when I, I will still treat them with respect. I will still, do everything as I would with anyone else. I'm not saying I treat anyone ever differently, but sometimes in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I think this one's going to turn out to be rocky soil. Or I think this one's going to turn out to be thorny soil. And I have been surprised many times over. I have been dead wrong. I have seen God work in hearts, and I've seen that seed grow, and I've seen it sprout, and I've seen people grow spiritually. But if you'd asked me a couple years ago, I wouldn't have thought so. But God can do amazing things. Never count out the power of God in someone's lives. And then he tells us the parable of the mustard seed. This idea that at first you don't think much of it, but then it turns out to be a blessing. And that's how we ought to be. The tree is a blessing for the birds and for everything else to be able to come and to lodge in the branches. And so for us in our faith, it's not, we don't make a big deal of ourselves at the outset, but as we go on down the road, our faith ought to result in blessings for others. It ought to be something that changes lives for other people on down the road. And so then as we get into the end of chapter 4, starting there in verse 35 and going all the way through the end of chapter 5, he tells us 4 miracles. And I think it's interesting. He lumps the parables together, and then he lumps the miracles together. He tells us about Jesus calming the storm. It says, on that day, so maybe the day that he had been talking some of these parables, says on that day evening had come, they went across, and so they're saying this is not the time he walked on the water, but this is the time when they all go out together and the storm comes up. He's asleep back there with his head on the pillow. I mean, you've been there before. You got to be tired to sleep in the middle of a storm like that. But I think we've each been there at times. So he's asleep, and they come and they get him. And they say, "Carest thou not that we perish?" Do we ever sing that song, "Master, the tempest is raging"? Oh, that's a good one. But then he comes and he says, "Peace, be still." And they say, "Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" And then that very night, as they do get to the other side of the sea, the country of the Gerasenes or Gadarenes or however your version says it, and he heals this demoniac man, and as he starts talking, finds out that it's not just one demon, this is a legion of demons. And so how many is it? We don't know for sure. I've heard some commentators say maybe even up to 6,000 demons in this one man. But it's bad. It will suffice to say that it's a bad situation that this man is in. And Jesus comes and he heals him, and afterward they find him sitting in his right mind. And that part just amazes people. But can you imagine this? Can you imagine what this day is like in the life of Jesus? There's a Max Lucado book called "In the Eye of the Storm," where he kind of traces through some of this stuff. Jesus is already tired. Look, it's the end of the day. Verse 35 of chapter 4, it's already evening. He's been teaching all day, and it's evening, and he gets on the boat, and he falls asleep, and he's so tired already so tired that he's sleeping in the middle of a raging storm, so bad that all these experienced, seasoned fishermen think they're about to die. He's not out there with some novices who've never been in a boat before saying, "Oh no, we're going to die." No, these are experienced fishermen who are convinced they're about to die. It's a bad storm. And so he calms the sea. They get to the other side. Is this middle of the night, wee hours of the morning? Is it dark when this crazy man breaking chains comes running up to him? I mean, you talk about spooky. At the end of this long day, the long night on the boat, and he gets over here. Sometimes when we think about Jesus and all the things that he suffered, we can talk about his passion. We can talk about the whips. We can talk about the crown of thorns. We can talk about all that, and it seems kind of abstract to us. Because none of us have ever been whipped like that. None of us have ever actually worn a crown of thorns. That all seems very abstract. But I think when we get acquainted with the Jesus who spent all day teaching, who was so tired he falls asleep in the middle of a storm, who goes through these crazy experiences, maybe his back is aching, maybe he wakes up hoarse the next morning and his voice is going out. We've experienced those things. We know what that's like. And that is where we can see that he has been tempted in all points, like as we are. Not just in the big things leading up to the cross, but in the little things, every step of the way. And so we've got another sandwich here in the middle of chapter 5, which I won't go into a lot of detail because this is actually what we're going to talk about in the sermon tonight. I encourage everybody to come back at 5 o'clock and I encourage everybody to come back at 5 o'clock for the sermon tonight. We're going to really be diving into this with Jairus and his daughter and the woman who has this issue of blood. But you see, we've got another sandwich because Jairus, this synagogue official, this ruler of the synagogue, he's a very important guy, comes running to Jesus and falls down begging for him to come heal his daughter. He's desperate. He knows his daughter is at the point of death. And so it doesn't matter, it said earlier that there were these scribes who had come down from Jerusalem. All of the Jewish officials, all the bigwigs in Judaism already kind of, got their eye on Jesus. Jairus doesn't care. doesn't care. And it points out the first time it calls him Jairus, but if you go on through that story, every time it says the ruler or the official or Mark specifically emphasizes that he is a leader among the people. But all that is out the window. He is desperate, he is humble, and he's willing to come to Jesus. But as Jesus is on his way, through that thick crowd, here comes this woman who's had this issue of blood for 12 years. And what all she has been through. She's spent all of her money on doctors, and she hasn't gotten any better, only worse throughout all these years. And as a boy growing up, I had no clue what this sickness she could possibly have was. And I hope a lot of you guys realize it without me having to say it up here. But this was something that she had really been dealing with, something she was really self-conscious about, something you don't really talk about in public a lot. And so she, knowing that, she is ceremonial unclean, she wants to go to Jesus. And think about this. She thinks she's this insignificant person over here who's never going to get the attention of Jesus. But now she's gotten the bravery up to come out. But then there's this crowd. And then there's Jairus. And she's like, oh, he's talking to Jairus now. I'm never going to get his attention. He's on his way to Jairus' house. And so she's kind of like the four friends in Mark chapter 2. She gets this plan in her mind. She thinks, well, I know I'm ceremonial unclean. I know he can't touch me, and I can't touch him. But maybe if I just touch the hem of his garment. And she does. She touches the hem of his garment, and she's healed. And Jesus feels that zap. I don't know what it felt like. Did he just, oh, what was that? I don't know how it felt, but he knows that the power has gone out from him. And he gives her the time and attention that she thought would never be possible. He looks at her caringly and says, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. Isn't that amazing? And then he goes on, and we'll just cut to the chase with the story of Jairus and his daughter. Yeah, she died, but then he raised her from the dead. And so you've got these four miracles back to back to back to back, where Jesus performs a miracle over nature, over demons, over sickness, and over death. And these are kind of, most of the miracles that Jesus does, you can fit into kind of one of these four categories. And Mark presents them all here for us to show that where these two kingdoms are at war in this world, the tide is turning. It has begun. God's kingdom is starting to spread. He's fighting back the forces of Satan. He's pushing back. He's casting out demons. He's got power over the water and the wind. He's got power over sickness. He's got power over death. The kingdom of God has come. It's on the move. Good things are happening. The tide is turning. And we know which kingdom is going to win. No doubt about it in our minds. The question is, are we on the Lord's side? Are we participating in the will of God? Not just trying to, like roll the dice and make a decision. Oh yeah, okay, maybe I need to make this. No. Are we participating in the will of God? Are we a member of that kingdom, a force for good as this kingdom is marching on? It's a beautiful, messy, complicated, wonderful family. And if you're not part of it this morning, come be part of it. Get on board with what God is doing. Be part of this kingdom. You can put him on in baptism. We'd be honored to do that this morning. We'd be honored to serve alongside you, to fight shoulder to shoulder in this kingdom on throughout the rest of our time here together on this earth. If you've been fighting for the kingdom but maybe fallen away or let other priorities get in the way, get back on the front lines. Today is the day. If there's anything that we can do as a church family, you can come as we stand and sing.